Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I want to welcome you to our webinar today, co-hosted by the Global Footprint Network and Schneider Electric, talking about strategies for One Planet Prosperity. I'm joined today by my guests, Mathis Wackernagel from the Global Footprint Network, and Esther Finadori from Schneider Electric. My name is Amy Haddon, and I will serve as your moderator today. The webinar will cover the concept of One Planet Prosperity, and Mathis, Esther, and I will be having a rich conversation about that topic throughout the webinar. But we encourage you to submit any of your questions or comments via the chat function. We'll spend some time on those at the end of the call, but we will capture all of your questions and respond to them. We also are recording this session, and your line is muted. And thank you again for joining us today. We're starting with a fairly simple premise. First, that one planet prosperity is preferable to one planet misery. That is, living in harmony with the resources that our planet provides is better than the alternative. We also believe that companies that prepare themselves for a one planet compatible economy are better primed to build and maintain competitive advantage for the long term. And I think this is a very interesting idea, and I know that Mathis will speak more about this, that in order for us to build this competitive advantage, we must shift the conversation around corporate sustainability from something that's noble to something that's necessary, and that by doing so, we enable the groundswell for that one planet prosperity to occur. And finally, together, we're working to really move the date of Earth Overshoot Day, which we'll spend some time talking about. Much of the content in this webinar is based on an ebook that we recently published. You were sent the URL prior to the presentation, and it's also listed here again for you if you'd like to download that and keep it at the ready or view that material after the webinar. So let me introduce the concept of Earth Overshoot Day just briefly. Effectively, right now, we're demanding more than the Earth can renew. We're using, in effect, 1.6 Earths, and as of August 22nd, we had exhausted all of our resources for the year from one planet. Now, what's really interesting is that we can think of that as our budget for the planet. And yet, and I will ask Mathis this, how is this possible, given that we still are consuming raw materials after August 22nd? Mathis?
Thank you, Amy, and thank you all for joining us today. So as Amy said, indeed, if we just do the basic accounts of all the demands we put on nature compared to what Earth can renew from January 1st to August 22nd, we've used as much as Earth can renew in the entire year. And then people ask me, so on August 23rd, I still have beer in my fridge. Like, what? You must be wrong. You know, what's up with that? And I think the easy answer is the following. It's like with money. Some of us are able to spend more than what we earn. You know, you can do that for some time, but not forever. And the same thing is true with ecological resources. What Earth provides us, we can use them faster than they are being renewed, and then there are consequences. It basically depletes the nature, and we see consequences of deforestation through lowering of groundwater levels, overfishing, etc. One big one where we have a huge debt already is the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere. That's kind of accumulates over a long time. So yes, we can overspend for some time, but it doesn't serve us. And so what we recognize is that the one planet idea is not an idea out there. It's not even a goal. It's just our context. That's the budget. So what's the advantage of overspending? It's the same as with finances. And I think that's the point. So yes, it's possible. Is it beneficial? For humanity, it's not. And now the big question we are asking, I think today, what's the implication for businesses?
And so I would ask you about that, Mathis, that, you know, I think that for most of us, that concept of planetary budget makes sense. But obviously, businesses are consuming a considerable amount of those raw materials. So how does this concept really apply to business?
Yeah. So we have learned a lot through we actually have been in partnership with Schneider Electric for the last 4 years, I believe. And so things have crystallized through that. And I think the core insight that Amy already provided is the following. And it sounds to most people probably in the call like CSR, something noble, something nice to do, but it's ultimately quite cutthroat, I would say, to say the following. If a business provides goods and services that enable humanity's ability to succeed, and succeeding eventually means how can we all thrive within the planetary constraints? If a business offers its services, its offering that help humanity succeed, you put yourself on a path that opens markets, that makes it more easy for you to be around, that you are needed. If it's the opposite, if you don't offer that, you basically plan your own obsolescence. So it's not just kind of, oh, are you nice enough? Is that an additional thing you take on as a business? Rather, it's the opposite. It's say, are you putting yourself on a strong footing? If you took a soccer analogy, for those who like soccer, it's a bit like making sure you're playing downhill. Now there may still be Ronaldo and Messi being on the other side playing against you, so it's not guaranteeing your win, but it makes it much easier to have the advantage on your side. It makes kind of on average it more likely that you will be around. So that's kind of the underlying premise. It seems, actually, if you think about it, it seems so obvious. Why do you even have to say it? But I think the strange thing is that we hold sustainability so much as the noble cause that we forget it's actually essential.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Mathis. And I would ask you a follow-up then that so many organizations now are embracing sustainability. How do we know if a company is really enabling this one planet prosperity?
Yeah, yeah. And so it's not an imposition on others. It's a guiding post for companies to see, are we strengthening ourselves or not? So it's not about complying with something from the outside and making sure you look good. In the end, measure what you treasure, you know. So that's kind of the idea. And perhaps, I mean, the idea is quite simple. One planet prosperity, it's another way of saying sustainable development, or the Chinese call it ecological civilization. It's this tension between two things, that we want to live well. We all want to live well, but there's also only so much budget, ecological budget, to say. So it's kind of this play between these two things. That's really the essence of the whole thing. So there are two dimensions, and then you can graph it up in some simple ways. So one dimension on the horizontal here is how well do we live? We can use, for example, the United Nations Human Development Index as a first approximation. I mean, I don't see the most ideal one, but that's kind of the one that is used a lot. And higher on that scale, up to 1, that's nirvana. 0 is about hell, you know. So, and then on the other scale, you look at the budget and say, okay, the most simple way, how many plans does it take if everybody lives like you? Now that gives you a budget constraint. Now, we may not want to use the entire planet because there are other species out there as well, you know, that need food. So 1 is actually quite generous, and we maybe want to be higher than 0.7. So Europe typically on average between 0.8 and 0.9. So that gives us this green box that shows where one planet prosperity actually happens. Outside, for sure, we don't have one planet prosperity. Inside the box, it becomes possible. So that's kind of like I say, that's where we would be comfortable. Now, for businesses, what does it mean? If you enable humanity's success, it means that the dots here, the dots represent countries, but we could make a dot for every city, for every customer, for every individuals. These are the people we serve, and the question is, are we helping them move towards that box? It's kind of an invitation to think inside the box, to make a little bit of a joke, but that's kind of really what we're trying to do. Is, are you helping with your offering, with your services and products, your clients to move in this direction? And so that's then becoming kind of the two major possibilities, and they're not mutually exclusive, but we call them strategy A and B, and we hope we find better names for them in one point. But it's essentially saying, one, strategy A, help maintain high quality of life using far fewer resources, being far less resource dependent. So it makes you more secure because you're able to maintain this metabolism. That's one strategy. And I think Schneider Electric is primarily in that field. Not only, but and then the other strategy is to look at kind of key needs, because we know a lot about the future, and we know that people will want to eat, they will want to sleep, they want to live safely, they want to be comfortable. We know that. So people's needs, we know about the future, and then the question is, how can we deliver upon them in a way that is replicable? Because then that's a way of delivering that can be extended to many. that need it. So that becomes then measurable. You can see to what extent are your offerings helping your ultimate clients, the users of your services, to be far more secure. So it's a win-win. And that's, I think, where the idea breaks down from the soccer game I told about. Because if you think about soccer championships, world championships, only one team wins, everybody else loses. And here's kind of the opposite. One Planet Prosperity recognizes the positive sum game. If you're able to do it, it makes it more likely for others to do it as well. So we're not just improving our own situation. It's a bit like COVID. Like the main thing you can do with COVID is to protect yourself, because that protects everybody else. It's a service to humanity. It's not just because you're afraid of yourself, but it's actually a service to others. And the same thing is true with One Planet Prosperity, that by protecting yourself and making yourself ready for the future we can anticipate, that's good for your clients. It's good for your shareholders. It's good for your staff. It's good for everybody. There's no real big downside. And you're building things that will gain in value in the future that we can predict. So even though it may happen in the future, the value of the future is already present in our current balance sheet if we do it correctly. Because if you own things that are not fit for the future, and owning maybe you own a market, you own product lines, they have long-term kind of delays. If you own the right assets for the future, you hedge against difficulties in the future by not losing value and by not losing it at difficult times.
Thank you, Mathis. Let me ask you a quick follow-up question, and I would invite Esther to comment here too, which is that I think many on the call are familiar with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and I wonder how you could connect this strategy A and B concept to the SDGs.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's related. The SDGs. The SDGs are strategies of how to get there, but I think we put things a little bit upside down. We don't say, please be nice and good, and you have to comply, and you have to make like a commitment to something. Because if you make commitments, why are there no commitments between ministers about reducing unemployment? Because they all understand that's necessary, you know. So what we offer here is a compass for everybody else, and say, if there's no commitment out there, if there's no global agreement, it makes your action even more important for yourself to be able to navigate the storm that is coming. So yes, it's related, kind of, that we recognize that's kind of the common dream. Just the approach is to say, actually, it's much more connected to basic business strategy than we typically hold. And I think that's one of the big barriers. And that's kind of why we call it noble versus necessary, that we fool ourselves believing this is the noble cause, and then we relegate it to Sunday afternoons, and then we wonder why we're not getting there.
Right. Central versus extra. Yes.
Yeah. Not just a nice to have, it's actually essential. Yeah.
Esther, I wonder if you might want to comment on that too, just knowing that we use the SDGs ourselves at Schneider, and how we've adopted this organizing principle of One Planet Prosperity.
Of course, Amy. True. So we like the SDGs. They're a useful tool to map our actions, communicate them to our stakeholders, internally, employees, externally, suppliers, customers, investors. They're a usual framework to explain, communicate, act together. But I fully agree with Mathis. One Planet Prosperity is really a strategic framework, something that helps you think differently. Start from one planet boundaries to your own strategy and operations, which is really what's powerful with the concept, and helps think differently. Whereas the SDGs I see today for corporations like Schneider as useful communication tools, but maybe not as powerful to influence our strategic thinking.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And so, Mathis, you talked about this a little bit more, but I'll ask Esther to comment too. How is this concept of One Planet Prosperity and the two-pronged strategy really different than CSR? Do we have evidence that it really works better than just a noble commitment to sustainability? Esther, perhaps you'd like to start.
Sure. I mean, evidence is, the testimony Schneider Electric can bring on the table. As Mathis shared, we've been partnering now for several years, and this thought process of One Planet Prosperity has led us to ask, very sharp questions, both on our operations, the way we run the company, and on our strategy. On our operations, when you think with the One Planet Prosperity mindset, the question at hand is really, can you run the machine and generate your revenues in a world that is by design constrained? Can you, to run the machine and generate €1 of revenue, you need trucks, you need materials coming in, you need packaging, wood, resources, you need people traveling. And can you really still run that machine in a world that is under constrained resources is a question that helps you define targets for your own operational performance with really an outside-in lens, meaning really shifting the way you consider resources and value them much better in the way you design your operational strategy, rather than, I would say, traditional CSR that is more focusing on incremental year-on-year improvement intensity targets. With One Planet Prosperity, you think about absolute targets and where do we need to go in terms of decoupling the consumption of natural resources from our operations to be sustainable, meaning have a sustainable activity. A great example is science-based climate targets that are now quite well used by large companies. With science-based CO2 targets, for the first time, I think large corporations are taking absolute commitments on climate, absolute commitments to reduce emissions and not intensity targets. And that's a major mind shift in the way strategies are designed. In the second pillar, which is how does that influence our strategy? One Planet Prosperity enables you to ask the question, are your offers really aligned with the One Planet world, and are you able to succeed in the long term with your portfolio of offers? And as Mathis has very well explained, this is a positive sum game, meaning if through your offers you're helping customers be ready to operate within the boundaries of One Planet, then both wins, you as a corporation and your customer. And it's really a strategy compass that helps you, get better ready for the future. And at Schneider, we feel this is really today deeply embedded in our DNA, of course, thanks to the partnership with GFN, but not only, it's been now over 10 years that this has been embedded in our strategic thinking. And I can tell you this makes a big difference in the way we see the future of the company.
Thank you. And Mathis, more comment on that?
That's wonderful, Esther. I think we came to Schneider when this thinking was already there, so we just helped to crystallize the language a little bit and kind of shape it a little bit. But it's quite impressive to us what Schneider has been able to do, because they saw the writing at the wall and saw that they're aligned with these possibilities. That took the fear away. And so there's now this saying within Schneider, which I quite like to say, more Schneider, better planet, or better climate as well. Better climate, better planet. And it's true, and that's kind of enabling. So Schneider doesn't have to be afraid of the future because they are shaping the future we need, so that's quite impressive. And the other part is that we just put CSR on this slide. And I don't know if I'm allowed to say that here, but and I don't want to offend anybody, but I wish CSR had never been invented, because it sounds so great, it's so wonderful, let's be responsible. But what people hear is always between the line. If it's so responsible, it must be a cost. How can we afford, like, running a business is already difficult enough? How do you also want to be kind of socially responsible? Okay, we do a little bit about it, we want to look good. and that's such a kind of warped way, because in the end, it's so essential. Like, without having the resources to operate, you won't be able to operate. So it's essential condition for success. So that's why I think, and that's why I emphasize again, when we say, are you enabling humanity to succeed? Many people hear it as CSR. And so I want to emphasize again, this is cutthroat. Not that I love cutthroat, but I think it's really essential to your bottom line, your ability to succeed.
Great. Thank you, Mathis. So Esther, you began talking a bit about how we've adopted One Planet Prosperity into our strategy. I wonder if you could actually share a bit more with the audience around some of the tactical things that we're doing.
Sure. I would like to share three things. I could share more, but I would like to share three things on how we're using this concept in a very concrete ways. First is we use One Planet Prosperity as really a framework to assess the relevance of our offers, meaning, are these offers really enabling to save the dates? And in fact, what we did with GFN a couple of years back is quantify how much we could move the dates back towards the 31st of December if Schneider's and our partner technologies were applied everywhere across the world: energy efficiency, renewable, and retrofitting existing infrastructure. And we found that, with existing current off-the-shelf technologies, we could move the date by 21 days if tomorrow we deployed and used those technologies. And this, shows us that our offer portfolio is aligned with our purpose, which is to bring more efficiency to the world. It's also a way to assess offers that, maybe today are not at the right level of performance, gaps, new markets we should address where we see untapped potential for efficiency, or new technologies to develop, to move all the way back to the 31st of December. So it is really a strategic compass we use to go from the purpose, which is delivering efficiency to the world, to looking in a very concrete manner at our portfolio of offers and understanding how they can move the data or not. The second thing we do is, beyond this strategic exercise, we try increasingly to really quantify impact. So not stay in the realm of qualitative assessments, but really look at quantified impact on the environment. And for us, the major material impact, of course, is climate. So since 2018 now, we're quantifying and disclosing externally how much CO2 we help our customer to save. Of course, we're looking at our own emissions along the value chain. So what's the climate cost of producing the gear we sell, the services we provide, the software we sell to our customers, and also what's the impact of those equipments when used by customers. And for us, improving our own efficiency means increasing the multiplier between our own impacts and the outcomes enjoyed by our customer. And this exercise of quantification, I think, is very much in the spirit of One Planet Prosperity framework. And for us, really is very valuable and changes the nature of discussion that is being held within businesses. And third thing I want to share is we want to celebrate achievements much more, both with our customers and on our own perimeter, our own operations, because we see that positive communication is really a trigger to inspire and generate more and more action. With customers, we really strive to share best practices that and efficient designs that we've been able to create, and you have a few of those examples in the ebook. On own operations as well, we join coalitions, for instance, with the climate group on renewable electricity, on energy efficiency, on electric vehicles, where companies can first take, ambitious and commitments towards reducing CO2 emissions, and even more importantly, share valuable practices between themselves through webinars, through publications, and this is something we can only hope it will grow, because we see it as a very useful way to inspire and accelerate action in Schneider.
Thank you, Esther. And we had an audience question that I think is very relevant to this conversation at the moment, which is, are we finding that customers are willing to pay more for solutions that are sustainable? And Mathis, I would invite you to comment as well from your work with some other organizations. Or, is that part of the equation that that a good has to cost more if it's sustainable?
I think it's the other way around. I mean, the value proposition of sustainable investment is much, much higher. Because, for example, maybe there may be slightly higher upfront costs, but if you look at the whole life cycle cost, the sustainable solution has to be much cheaper. And I think we often discount the future too much and don't realize the value that what we have. So I think that's kind of the interesting thing when we look at. I think there's feedback from Esther. What I find quite fascinating is that the CEO of Schneider Electric Jean-Pascal Tricoire. He wants to know every month, like how much CO2 are we using ourselves compared to how much we're saving. He wants to physically understand, is our machine getting more valuable? I think
we're getting a little bit of background, Esther. I think that may be your phone.
Yeah, that's good. So anyhow, so he wants to understand, is the machine called Schneider Electric getting more effective as a machine, as a physical machine, to provide more CO2 savings per CO2 effort? You know, so that becomes a functional thing. Of course, you want to understand, does it produce profit in the end? But you have to understand also, is the physical nature of the machine getting good, so it actually is able to produce this economic value? And I think that distinguishes Schneider from, I don't want to name the company, but a few years back, there was a large French telecommunication company. They had also their sustainability report, and they reported CO2 emissions, and the CO2 emissions were larger than the entire country of France. How can that be? It cannot be. It must be wrong. Nobody got fired because it was not relevant to them. I think the core is to recognize how relevant this is to create value. If you invest in the wrong assets, the value of these assets will be going to zero at a time when the economy is weak. So economically, to invest in things that don't have a future is actually, I mean, it's shooting your own foot. So economically, it's much more preferable to invest in sustainable solutions. And of course, there could be higher upfront costs, but from a net present value perspective, from a true net present value perspective, the sustainable solution wins hands down.
Fully agree, Mathis. And so first is, of course, and increasingly we see customers valuing the full life cycle cost of solution and not just the initial upfront cost. Not yet fully happening, but probably increasingly, especially with new thoughts, leadership with COVID, people thinking about the risk of having stranded assets, and what if my building was worth zero tomorrow because nobody wants to use it because it's poor, not energy efficient, not comfortable. Also, we didn't mention, but for companies, it's about securing your license to operate. If tomorrow civil society, your own customers and users are not willing to buy and to support your authorization to operate, your business is not going to be so thriving. So for all these reasons, often sustainability of solutions are in fact not more expensive. And also what I can add to that, it's our job at Schneider Electric, and it's the job of all companies to think differently and invent different value propositions, saying if the equipment in itself, in some cases, is more expensive with more upfront costs, then we can move from CapEx models to as a service model. And it's back to us to innovate, not only on the solution we sell, the technology, but also how we package it and how we sell it to customers, so that we can facilitate market adoption and remove some of the barriers, including costs. So it's a bit of both, but I think in that game there's really a market, and we see it every day for efficient solutions to be adopted by customers.
That's great. Thank you both so much. And I appreciated that you brought up the life cycle costs, Esther, because I think so often the price tag of a good does not necessarily include all of the various externalities, subsidies, et cetera, that actually go into the full price. So I appreciated that you said that. So this is a concept that I think we were dancing around a bit earlier, which is that in this model of one planet prosperity, that becomes the organizing principle that you operate around. It's not a nice to have, it's not at the fringes, it's not what you focus on a Sunday afternoon. And so given that assumption, how can that actually drive corporate decision making? And Esther, I'd ask you to respond to this one first, since this is how we are operating at Schneider.
Sure. So probably I will have quite a pragmatic answer, and then Mathis can inspire us with a broader view. For us at Schneider, it's pretty straightforward. First, it's about quantification of end-to-end impact. So really looking at full life cycle suppliers of suppliers, but also customers and end of life, of environmental impact, social impact, whatever is material to your business. and understanding this is back both in terms of negative impacts, but also positive impacts that you might enable along the way, CO2 savings, for instance, with energy efficient technologies. Second, once you have this quantified understanding of where you stand, then you challenge it against one's planet prosperity. Where do we need to go? And you can assess the relevance of your strategy, of your offers, and your contribution to building one planet prosperity. And from there, domain by domain, you can take action. So being pragmatic within a design process, R&D, you can embed an efficient eco-design process. One planet prosperity will never be the only factor you look at. Of course, you would look at quality, at safety, at customer needs. You would look at the price of your offer. But if it's well understood and fully embedded into the design process, then you can come up year after year with new generations of products that deliver additional efficiency. And often you also open a gate of sharp innovation, out of the box thinking that is very valuable for a company. So design in your own operations, you start thinking differently. How can I source energy in a different manner, in a way that's really sustainable, for instance? You think about, instead of buying energy year after year through commodity contracts, can I secure long-term contracting with a renewable developer? That would be great, would have additionality on the network, and it would drive my operational CO2 footprint towards zero. So you start opening doors to new ways of doing business. Of course, it has to make sense from a business standpoint. You need to protect the profitability of your company, but it enables different mind thinking, etc., etc. So domain by domain, by applying, having quantified impact and applying this framework, you can design your transformation programs to change the way the company operates.
That's really inspiring, Esther. Thank you. I'm hearing it as really a shift in thinking and looking at it as an opportunity for innovation across the organization.
Yeah, maybe one.
Oh, go ahead.
Just one last example I would like to add. I just thought about it. Is a lot of it is about how do you value externalities like climate or biodiversity resources, knowing that today they're not properly valued in the economy. And that's that's feasible as a company today. When we design our supply chain strategy, looking at our factories, our distribution centers, the way they're organized around the world, we do factor in a price to climate to see if the industrial organization is sustainable in a world where CO2 would be priced from, and we use 30 and 130 euros per ton of CO2 as short-term, mid-term CO2 pricing range, to really challenge our strategic design against what we expect the future will be.
And certainly there's growth and interest in carbon pricing, so I anticipate that that we'll see a lot of change on that topic over the coming decade. Mathis, anything that you would add?
It's wonderful what Esther said, and I think would have probably told about the same thing just from the experience. I think there's often the mistake made that companies just kind of have products and they just think, oh, how can you make that product a little bit more efficient? And that's kind of the core question around sustainability. And to limit yourself to that question is a big mistake, I think. Rather, as Esther points out, it's helping shape where do we need to be in the future? What kind of offerings, what kind of services and products will be needed in the future that we can predict? And that then drives that drives innovation. And I think there's a big mistake again to believe that businesses are just driven by quarterly returns. Of course, that's a big pressure. I mean, not to deny that. But in reality, most businesses have incredible time lags. You don't build a new market within a year, or you don't build new product lines within a year. It's like the innovation cycle, particularly for more complex offerings. And most large companies have quite complex offerings, take a very long time horizon. And so we don't need to think how something performs in the market of yesterday. We need to think how will it perform in the market that we can predict, and that puts you in a much stronger trajectory. And I think that's that's at the core of the One Planet Prosperity idea. And I think Esther explained it very well in very practical terms.
Mathis, I'll actually use that as an opportunity to ask another question that I've seen come across from the audience, which is relevant, I think, to that quarterly returns drumbeat. Is one planet prosperity possible when people, countries, organizations are acting selfishly, are really only measuring success in terms of profitability? I wonder if either of you could comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, if you only measure success in profitability, you will not be successful because you're blind to many forces that shape your future. So that's why I think it's about necessary. It's not about noble. You need to understand the full territory. And as you're a pilot, you have some essential things on your dashboard, and different things are relevant at different parts of the flight. So just say there's just one thing, you'll crash into a mountain for sure. That's a given.
Yes, as Esther was saying previously, the license to operate is real. That if you're a bad citizen, however you define that, your license to operate can be revoked, whether by society or by nature.
And then even another point, or if I can add that small point, if you think the whole world operates like that, everybody only cares about the profit, so why should you do something different? Actually, if that truly is the world you're operating in, it becomes even more important for yourself to think more broadly, because the world is more unstable, and the future that we fear of more resource constraints and more climate change is even more likely. And if you're not ready yourself, you put yourself at risk even more. So if the others don't do it, even more reason for you to do it.
And it becomes a differentiator then. Yes. Esther, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, of course. So, of course, if profitability is your only KPI, you're going to miss out on many things. But, today already profitability is far from being the only KPI. A CEO will look at, for instance, at talent retention, talent acquisition and retention in the market. And we all know that today, increasingly, people are looking for a sense of purpose in their everyday job. And that operating within the means of one planet is definitely something, a competitive advantage a company can leverage in that game. CEOs, they also look at, risks and how to secure the access to critical resources that are needed for the business. This can be, material resources like rare earths, some metals. If tomorrow you're not able to source the material, I'm not talking even about money here and price, I'm talking about access to volumes. If you're not able to source the volumes you need to operate because those volumes are not available anymore, then your company is just going to go down. So security of access to resources is definitely something strategic CEOs look at. Maybe one last example is, the CEOs look at the capacity of the company to innovate. All of them have some sort of KPI to measure innovation, how vibrant innovation is within the company. And with One Planet Prosperity frameworks, we can stimulate this innovation DNA in the right direction. And this is also something CEOs look at. So today, profitability, at least for a company like Schneider, is definitely not the sole KPIs the company would focus on. And there are other KPIs, sometimes on more qualitative topics, but are definitely very high in the agenda of leaders.
That's great. Thank you both so much for your inputs on that question. So here's a controversial topic that I find many of our clients are curious about, or that there's discussion about, which is this idea of voluntary corporate action versus regulation. Are companies acting voluntarily, whether that's through nobility, Mathis, or through pressure they're experiencing from their stakeholders? Is that voluntary corporate action enough to move us toward One Planet Prosperity, or is regulation really necessary for change? And Mathis, perhaps you could respond to that first.
Of course, if we had the regulatory context and global agreement, everything would be much, much easier. For humanity would benefit from that, clearly, no question. But here the question is, what should corporations do? And as I said before, in the absence of global agreements, the storm will be even more turbulent, and you have to be even better prepared for it. So it's actually so waiting for regulatory guidance is not a very good business model. Yeah, and that, for example, we work with an interesting agency in Scotland, the Environment Protection Agency of Scotland. They took One Planet Prosperity on as their overarching regulatory framework to recognize that, yes, it's important to have regulations and pollution control and to be the police, so people have to comply. But even if we comply, we will not get there. So as even a regulatory body, they say, we need to work with the businesses that kind of the best businesses that move forward to move us in a direction that allow us to have an economy that operates for Scotland. Now that's a regulatory approach. I think it's kind of the other side. From a business perspective, don't wait for the enlightened regulation, either from the world or from your country or your region, because you need to think about your own ability to operate. So that's, again, emphasizing the necessary over the noble. It's not a noble cause. It actually is even more necessary if there's a lack of regulatory guidance.
Esther, anything you would add or comment on?
Sure, I agree with Mathis. It's definitely both. I mean, regulation is very necessary, and as a corporation, we participate in and collaborate with governments, public agencies around the world to shape those regulations. And the word lobbying today is perceived with a very negative, intention, but that's not the reality. At least not how I see it. Companies can help governments shape the right acceleration to address some markets, to untap some of the potential, and regulation can definitely help for either accelerate or expand something that is starting with a few leaders to all companies and all activities. At the same time, we see that in some countries regulation can go backwards, like the US recently, and we see other very positive pressure coming for us today, for instance, from investors that are asking increasingly very sharp question on the sustainability alignment of our strategy. And we shouldn't wait only on regulation to move forward. This is definitely a competitive advantage to anticipate and to shape corporate action before it becomes fully compulsory. So the two go hand in hand. I don't think they should be opposed at all. It's depending on the topic, depending on the time, on the country, one or the other might be the most efficient lever.
That's great. Thank you, Esther. And actually, I just got a question from the audience that I think is relative here, which is, we've been talking a lot about how this move towards One Planet Prosperity and really bringing that into an organization as an operating principle requires a shift in mindset. Could either of you comment on how important it is for individuals to be thinking innovation in terms of their own roles and their own ability to lead and make change in an organization? Any suggestions for individual leaders out there?
It's at the end of the day, it's all about people. If you're convinced, in the full of your heart that One Planet Prosperity is really necessary, and you adopt this as a framework to analyze the world around you and really as a compass to guide your decisions, of course you will have a huge impact on your organization, whatever your role, whether you're in design, in procurement, in operations. So of course, as I would say an employee, by adopting this framework, you can make a big change. But not only, and that's why I would like to refer back to Mathis, every day in our day-to-day life, it's the same. And GFN has published, is designing a great calculator that enables you as an individual, as a person, as a citizen, to calculate your footprint. And this is really eye-opening to change the way you live and your day-to-day habits and see the impact you can have with your own decisions. So both in the corporate world and in the personal life, of course, at the end of the day, it's all about people and leadership and decision-making.
Thank you.
Perhaps to add to that wonderful answer from Esther, we only live in our own body. or we only live in ourselves, so we make choice around it. If we see ourselves as just kind of guided by a moral compass, are we doing the good thing or not? We build up this tension between doing good and doing well in some ways in ourselves. And we see the doing good as a cost and a kind of an extra step. Probably repeating what I said before. But I think if we help ourselves by looking at the word, if decision making is much more like betting, and perhaps people think that's morally reprehensible to say, like going to Las Vegas and making bets, it's about which bets will work out best. The better you're informed about the word and recognize, will what I do be needed in the future? That's a much better guidance, and you start to see how can you contribute to shape what's needed to succeed for yourself and for the others. And you see that you are in this web of life, that we are one biology, we're all interconnected, which we have found out with COVID-19, for example, how interconnected we are. That from looking from a betting perspective is not, oh, do you believe in climate change or not? But if there's that likelihood, what kind of things will be more helpful in the future? So it becomes a very practical tool. And so rather than kind of by you think you can take responsibility, you actually put a wedge in yourself without recognizing it. So that you put this tension between, oh yeah, I would like to be good, but this one is more tempting. So that's kind of this whole temptation versus the right thing, rather than just being much more pragmatic.
Thank you, Mathis and Esther. Great answer to that one. And a good segue, Mathis, you just mentioned COVID, and I'd be interested to hear from both of you on what you anticipate the impact of the pandemic will be on one planet prosperity. And Mathis, perhaps since you just brought it up, perhaps you can start.
Yeah, my thinking has been shifting a little bit, and like people are getting tired of COVID, and so kind of also there's this anxiety around it, and maybe we're losing some of the great lessons from COVID, but I think there's a number of interesting lessons. One is kind of the recognition of the connection and kind of the importance of resilience. I think that's also what Schneider brings to the table, that it's not just about efficiency and decarbonization, the digitization, allowing our systems to operate even in difficult situations. The value it has of having a resilient energy system is just cannot be underestimated. So I think we see what kind of values we need in the future and how we can deal with stress. And it is a very stressful time, so people don't like to think about it that much as well. But I think also how we are interconnected. But for me, the core lesson, which I may have mentioned already before, really is from the COVID side, kind of how that actually protecting yourself is a service to you, society overall. So rather than holding it out of how much are you willing to do to be nice to society, that actually it goes hand in hand. If I use often kind of the analogies, like there's a storm coming near a boat, waiting for others to act first and say, I will not fix my boat until everybody else fixes their boat, is not a very clever strategy. And I think that the same thing is true, like with COVID, saying, wow, by making my boat stronger, everybody will get stronger, because otherwise there's no other boat to swim to, in some ways. So I think it's a bit of a shocker. It also has taught us, and I think that's perhaps the last thing I want to say. I mean, there's so much to say about it, but recognition that we are actually biological beings. We look at the world too mechanistically. Then there's this linear idea: we take resources from one place, we throw it away somewhere else. But actually, there's no way. We're all in one biology together. And so how do you make this work? How do you recognize we're on spaceship Earth? Why is it not helpful to undermine the life support system, not just societally, but for yourself?
Yeah, great thought. Esther, anything you would add, particularly about our conference? Do you have any comments?
Yeah, as an organization, COVID has been really a very interesting, and it's still a very interesting period. First thing we see is, in a business as usual world, most evolutions are incremental. Each, small change is always a struggle. You have to get different entities or functions to collaborate. Doing things different is never easy. What we've seen over the past 6 months is our world, upside down. All of a sudden, things that were impossible 6 months ago, not only are possible, but they're implemented within under a month. So in fact, it's really a proof and a reminder. Probably, lately we've forgotten about it. Maybe it's more obvious for older generations that we can change the statu quo so fast if there's the shared understanding of the need to do so. So this is a really good lesson learned. Second thing I think is, I believe the word is from Churchill, it's not from me, but never waste a good crisis. I'm really inspired by that thought, because right now we have the opportunity to do things differently, because all of a sudden we don't have a blank sheet, but on many topics, in fact, the sheet is much blanker than what it used before. We have the opportunity to implement radical and sudden changes if they make sense. And we've seen that, every day I go to work, I see, lanes to cycle that were not there 2 months ago. I see people maybe buying food differently than what they did before, etc. So we see changes happening, and I think this is a special times, opportunities really to do some U-turns or L-turns on some of the ways we operate, or some policies at government level. Because we all have this common and shared understanding that things in fact can change really fast if it's for the right purpose.
That's just excellently said. Thank you, Esther. And I would just add that in some of our research, we've seen that organizations are actually doubling down on their initiatives during this period, despite any constraints they might be feeling. And for me, that's been very hopeful, that when companies maybe could have backed away from some of their commitments, they're actually taking the opposite approach and trying to accelerate them during this time. And I love that Churchill quote, so thank you for using it, because I do think there's an excellent opportunity here for all of us. So last question really for the two of you is, for any organizations that are on the line today that are really thinking about this one planet prosperity concept, this idea that collectively we can really move the date on Overshoot, what are some steps that they could take immediately to start to move their organization in that direction? Mathis, would you like to start?
I think the first step is the question, do you want to move the date? If you want, it becomes very easy. If you don't want, it doesn't go anywhere. So I think it's kind of recognizing, is that really needed? Is it needed for your own success or not? Once you're clear about that, anything becomes quite simple.
Yeah. Esther, anything you would add?
Yes, I think we've said most of it, but because it's really first and foremost, I think, a framework, a posture, a recognition of the external context. First, a concrete step is really adopting this framework, understanding it, and really looking at the purpose of the company, its strategy, and see how it aligns with a one planet prosperity world. So it is a concrete action, but it is true that it is at a very strategic level. Then to go to very operational grounds, so many things can be done. Today, the way we operate is not circular. Basically, most, the economy and most companies, we extract resources, we transform them, we use, and then we dispose. So helping that economy become more circular is a very pragmatic, very efficient way to save both resources and often money. Then, of course, sourcing renewable, cutting CO2 emissions, very that may be simple, but operational way, you can make a difference. So acting is easy. I would say, first and foremost, you have to adopt this concept as really a strategic compass to guide your organization.
Thank you both. And
I just want I wanted to add just that one planet prosperity is not a compliance issue or an imposition or something you have to do. It's just another tool in your toolbox to help you orient better. You're lost in the forest and get a compass, that's helpful. So that's it. If it helps you, great. If not, don't touch it. But we believe it's helpful to understand your context. That's kind of where systems thinking starts, by recognizing context. And what's the biggest context? It's ultimately that we live on one planet, so it has to fit within this. And we have recognized that humanity does not fit, and that's shifting everything. So the rules are shifting, not because we are reinventing new rules, but because suddenly the equilibriums are shifting and that other things are starting to influence what determines our success. So it's an offer, it's not an imposition.
That's excellently said, Mathis. Thank you. And I would just reference this slide, which is a graphic from the ebook that talks about sort of the 5 ways that an organization can take a look at how it's operating today to move closer toward that one planet prosperity goal. And so again, I would remind you about the ebook and encourage you to reference that for some additional content.